Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on main conclusion questions in the logical reasoning section. They're about 4% of all logical reasoning questions, so it's not a major question type, but it is an important one because it's a core skill. You need to be able to find the conclusion in order to evaluate arguments. In this question type, our entire goal is to simply find the conclusion of the argument. In this lesson, we're going to cover how to spot a main conclusion question, what the process is for approaching one is, what are some of the different types of conclusions we expect to see on the LSAT? And then what are the trap answer patterns that you need to be aware of on this particular question type? In this question stem, we're asked which one of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the argument. The language in here that tells us that we're looking at a main conclusion question is pretty obvious. It's main conclusion. In this question stem, it asks which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion drawn in the argument. So it's not asking for the main conclusion, but it is asking for the conclusion. The conclusion is a sign that you're looking at a main conclusion question. If it ever asks you for a conclusion that can be inferred, that's a must be true question. And you'll be looking at the definite article, a conclusion that can be inferred. But if it ever asks you to find the conclusion drawn, that's a main conclusion question, asking you to find the main conclusion of the argument. The process that you want to take when approaching a main conclusion question is to first identify what you think is the conclusion. Make sure that you understand what the evidence is that's used to support that conclusion. This way, it'll help you identify whether the conclusion that you initially identified is actually the main conclusion, or maybe it's an intermediate conclusion along the way. Then once you have organized the argument, you can anticipate what the answer would sound like and use trap answer patterns to make eliminations as you work through the choices. A common way that we find conclusions on the LSAT is to use language cues, words like therefore or hence, words that help us organize arguments. These words here help you identify conclusions. They directly introduce a conclusion. You can't guarantee that it's the main conclusion, but you do know that it is a conclusion. Maybe it's an intermediate conclusion, maybe it's the main conclusion, but at least you're heading down the right track of finding the conclusion. These words here help you identify the evidence, and they can also help you identify what the conclusion is in that these claims are supporting the conclusion. So if you know that this claim here that's being introduced by one of these words is supporting another claim, then you know that that other claim is a conclusion. These words here are introducing claims that provide support. These words help you identify a pivot in the argument, and a pivot is when the argument opposes another argument. So the argument is designed to refute someone's statement as opposed to assert something positively to be true. You use pivots to help you identify the author's position as opposed to the opposing position. Usually these words help you identify that you're moving away from the opposing point and into the author's point. Here's an example question. Go ahead and give this one a try. And when you think you've got the right answer, hit play again and we'll work it through together. All right, welcome back. In this one, the question stem asks us to find the conclusion. So we know we're looking for the main point. And then we have some paleontologists have suggested that Apatosaurus, a huge dinosaur, was able to gallop. Some paleontologists have suggested. Notice how the author is attributing this view to the paleontologists. And then it goes on to say, this, however, is unlikely. And that, however, is the pivot. And this is unlikely seems to be refuting the paleontologist's suggestion. And then we get this claim that begins with because, which is introducing support for the previously stated position, followed by this other information. Experiments with modern bones show how much strain they can withstand before breaking. By taking into account the diameter and density of Apatosaurus leg bones, it is possible to calculate that those bones could not have withstood the strains of galloping. This idea is used to support the point that galloping would probably have broken Apatosaurus's legs. So what we have here in the green is the evidence that is unsupported. In the blue, we have a conclusion that is being supported by the claims in green. And in the red, we have the author's main point. In yellow, we have the opposing point. And now that we understand the entire argument, we can anticipate the right answer. The right answer should say something like, this, however, is unlikely. And if we can't remember what this is, it's referring back to the previous statement, the statement that Apatosaurus, a huge dinosaur, was able to gallop. The author is saying that the Apatosaurus was probably unable to gallop. This structure is actually a very common one on main conclusion questions. In fact, 39% of main conclusion questions, the conclusion serves to refute a previously stated position. Why do they follow this template so much? Well, it's because it adds complexity to the argument. By introducing an opposing point and then having the author go on to refute it, it creates more of an argument structure for you to keep track of, and it makes it harder for you to know which claim is actually the main point. You could easily get the 2 points confused at some point along the way. If we look at answer choice A, galloping would probably have broken the legs of Apatosaurus. We can find that in the argument. But that's not the conclusion. That's the intermediate conclusion on the way to the main conclusion. So answer choice A is wrong. Answer choice B says it is possible to calculate that Apatosaurus's leg could not have withstood the strain of galloping. And that is in the argument, but again, that's in the green part of the argument, which means that it's evidence used to support the intermediate conclusion. Answer choice C says the claim of paleontologists that Apatosaurus was able to gallop is likely to be incorrect. That looks exactly like our pre-phrase. Let's hold on to answer choice C. Answer choice D says if galloping would have broken the legs of Apatosaurus, then Apatosaurus was probably unable to gallop. Well, this is not actually stated within the argument, but it is an assumption of the main argument here, that because galloping would probably have broken Apatosaurus' legs, it's unlikely that Apatosaurus was able to gallop. So answer choice D is an assumption underlying the main argument, not the main conclusion. Answer choice E says that modern bones are quite similar in structure and physical properties to the bones of Apatosaurus. Well, we do see something similar to that. It says in the argument, experiments with modern bones show how much strain they can withstand before breaking. In order to use a claim about modern bones to support a point about Apatosauruses, we need to know that the modern bones are quite similar in structure and physical properties. So we need to know that they're comparable. So answer choice E is an assumption underlying the intermediate argument. Again, it's wrong, and that means that answer choice C is the correct answer. Here's another example. Give this one a try. When you think you have the right answer, hit play again, and we'll work it through together. All right, welcome back. So in this one, it asks us to find the main conclusion of the argument. So it's fairly clear we're on a main conclusion question. As I read through this argument, there's a word that catches my attention. In fact, it catches my attention twice. It's the word should. Should is a recommendation, and recommendations involve value or preference, judgment. They suggest opinion, and opinion tends to serve the role of conclusions. An argument might take a look at some facts in the world and then make a recommendation about a couple of choices or a couple of options that might be in front of you, or to rank order the preferences of several different choices. That word should helps us find the conclusion, but in this case, it's in 2 sentences, and they can't both be the main conclusion of the argument. So to help us figure out which one of these is the main conclusion, the word "and" in the second sentence is really helpful. The word "and," that comma "and" structure, is telling us that in the second sentence there are 2 parts, and that they are equivalent to each other, and that they're not supporting each other, that they sit next to each other. So what that's telling us is that those two claims in the second sentence, since they're not supporting each other, they must be supporting the only other claim in the argument. So the second sentence is essentially 2 premises. And we know that they can't be conclusions because of the word "and," which tells us that they don't support each other, but that they serve together alongside each other, which means that the first sentence is the conclusion, which is the recommendation that double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible in scientific experiments. Keep that in mind as you go to look at the choices. Let's look at answer choice A. It says that scientists' objectivity may be impeded by interpreting experimental evidence on the basis of expectations and opinions that they already hold. This information is actually in the argument, but it's a premise, not the conclusion. It's playing the wrong role for this particular question type. We're looking for the conclusion, not the evidence. So we can get rid of it. Let's look at answer choice B. It says that it is advisable for scientists to use double-blind techniques in as high a proportion of their experiments as they can. That sounds like it matches the recommendation that double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible in scientific experiments. So let's hold on to answer choice B. That looks like a good contender. Answer choice C says that scientists sometimes neglect to adequately consider the risk of misinterpreting evidence on the basis of prior expectations and opinions. The term neglecting to adequately consider the risks of misinterpreting evidence, that's not an idea contained within the argument. That's simply out of scope. Answer choice D, whenever possible, scientists should refrain from interpreting evidence on the basis of previously formed expectations and convictions. Well, that's there in the argument, but that's there in the second half of the second sentence. So that's a premise of the argument. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says that double-blind experimental techniques are often an effective way of ensuring scientific objectivity. That is in the argument, but it's a premise of the argument. So that makes it wrong, and that means that answer choice B is the right answer. Here's the last example for this lesson. Go ahead and give this one a try, see if you can find an answer that you like. Hit play again when you're ready to review it together. All right, welcome back. The question is asking for the conclusion drawn in the geographer's argument. So we know we're looking for the conclusion, the main point. And in this case, we can use language cues to a certain extent, but in that first sentence, we see the word because, telling us that this is serving as support for something. And then in the second sentence, we get the words for this reason, telling us that what comes after this is supported by what came before it. So now we have an evidence-conclusion relationship between the first and second sentences. At this point, we get the word but, and the word but is a pivot. So, but recent research shows that this prediction is unlikely to be borne out. So we have a language cue, the word but, telling us that we're pivoting back into the author's position, away from the opposing point. And this claim here, recent research shows that this prediction is unlikely to be borne out. Actually, it follows along a couple of patterns in main conclusion questions. First, it follows the pattern of refutation. We looked at that earlier, where 39% of main conclusion questions work by refuting a previously stated position. But there's another pattern at work here that doesn't always follow the refutation model, which is we're looking at a prediction here. There were some people who were predicting that global warming would cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. This main conclusion is seeking to refute that prediction. And predictions are something we use regularly to help us find conclusions on main point questions, as well as on other kinds of arguments as well. 12% of main conclusion questions use a prediction in the conclusion, or you can use the idea that the statement is a prediction to help you identify it as the conclusion. Finally, the last sentence is support for the author's conclusion. So we've got an opposing support, followed by an opposing point, followed by a main conclusion, followed by a premise. So let's anchor ourselves on the conclusion. Recent research shows that this prediction is unlikely to be borne out. Let's make sure that we're clear about the word this and what it's referring to. Global warming would cause more frequent and intense tropical storms, that prediction. So the main point is that prediction that global warming is going to cause more frequent and intense tropical storms is unlikely to be borne out. If we go into the answer choices focused on that idea, we should have a fairly easy time finding the right answer. Answer choice A says that tropical storms are especially likely to form over warm ocean surfaces. Well, we see that, but it's not in the author's main point. It's in the support for the opposing point. So this is opposing support. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice B says that contrary to early discussions, global warming is not the only factor affecting the frequency and intensity of tropical storms. We get that. Other factors, such as instabilities in wind flow, are likely to counteract global warming effects on tropical storm development. This is an idea that's true, but again, it's not the main point. It's sitting in the evidence of this argument. Let's get rid of it. It's a premise. Answer choice C says that if global warming were reversed, tropical storms would be less frequent and less intense. Answer choice C is wrong, but I could imagine someone picking this one because if the conclusion of this argument is to refute the opposing point, answer choice C sounds like a negation of the opposing point. Right? The opposing point is that global warming would cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. Answer choice C says that if global warming were reversed, tropical storms would be less frequent and less intense. So it's literally the polar opposite of the opposing point. But the opposing point isn't trying to prove the polar opposite. It's just trying to say that that prediction is unlikely to be borne out. So Answer choice C, this negation of the opposing point, is actually a misconstrued perception of what the author's trying to say. Answer choice D says that instabilities in wind flow will negate the effect of global warming on the formation of tropical storms. Well, that part is in the argument, but it's not in the main conclusion. It's a premise. So let's get rid of D. That leaves us with E. Global warming probably will not produce more frequent and intense tropical storms. This is the author's main point, right? The refutation of the opposing prediction. So answer choice E is the right answer. So I talked about several different types of conclusions. Those that refute a previously stated position, maybe those that you can identify using language cues like since or because or therefore, those that serve as recommendations, a suggestion using the word should or ought, things that might be a prediction about the future based off of what we're seeing today. And then one that I didn't mention before is an explanation. So if you ever see a claim that offers an explanation for how or why another thing happened, that's another common form that we might use to help us find the conclusion within arguments on the LSAT. When you're working through the wrong answer choices, the kinds of reasons why answers are wrong on main conclusion questions, well, out of scope is something that will happen, but not happen that often. They're asking you to find the conclusion of the argument. And so the odds that they're going to bring in completely random terms, or if they do bring in answers that bring in completely random terms, it's going to make it fairly easy to spot. And so they won't be nearly as tempting as they might be, let's say, on a strengthened question or a weakened question. And so we see fewer of them on main conclusion questions. In terms of why most wrong answers are wrong is because they're providing a different role within the argument. Either it's giving you a premise, or it's giving you an opposing support or an opposing point. 38% of wrong answers on main conclusion questions are wrong because they're presenting a premise of the argument as opposed to the main conclusion. 19% are wrong because they're presenting information that is unsupported, meaning it twists or mangles the relationship between some terms found within the argument, but presents them in a slightly different way so that the meaning has been changed. 8% of wrong answers are wrong because they're presenting opposing support or an opposing point. 7% of them are wrong because they're presenting an assumption of the argument as opposed to the conclusion of the argument. And 7% are wrong because they're presenting an intermediate conclusion along the way to the main conclusion. Now, those can be very tempting because you will still see language cues that suggest conclusion. You'll still see relationships that indicate this is being supported by something else. The main conclusion is the ultimate goal. Like, what is it that we're here to prove? An intermediate conclusion is being supported by another claim and is supporting the main conclusion. The main conclusion does not support anything else. Sometimes you can use degree to also help you make eliminations. One way in which they'll take an answer choice and make it close but wrong is they'll strengthen the conclusion beyond what it's really trying to say. So sometimes if you're torn between two choices at the very end, they seem like they're both really, really close to the main conclusion. Look for a place where one of them has been strengthened such that it gets close to the main idea, but it takes it a little bit too far. Maybe something like the negation we saw in the last question. So in summary, you spot a main conclusion question with language in the question stem, and you're looking for words like the conclusion, the main conclusion, or the overall conclusion. There are several different types of conclusion structures that you want to be on the lookout for. Look out for refuting a previously stated position. 39% of main conclusion questions use that structure. 21% you can identify the main conclusion using language cues. Words like since and because introduce evidence, and so you can see what is being supported from that claim, pointing you to the conclusion. Or words like therefore and so and hence, they're introducing the conclusion directly. The conclusion represents a recommendation in 18% of main conclusion questions. The conclusion represents a prediction in 12% of main conclusion questions and an explanation in 9%. The trap answer patterns that you need to be on the lookout for are those that introduce other claims brought up or surfaced within the course of the argument, so things that play the role of a premise, or an answer choice that mangles the meaning of a statement or of a couple of statements, basically taking terms from within the argument and presenting them in the answer choice in a way that changes the meaning. Answer choices that are maybe a little bit too strong. Answer choices that are presenting an opposing point as opposed to the author's point. Intermediate conclusions on the way to the main conclusion, and ideas that represent an assumption underlying the argument as opposed to what the argument is trying to prove itself. So that's it for today's lesson on main conclusion questions. I invite you to check out these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.